Okay, good afternoon. Once again, we come back and start our classes on research methodology. So we were in research in module B and we were developing experimentation. Okay, so luckily we could get this council hall today, so we can continue our class because the technical issue is not yet resolved at the other place. But anyways, we continue it here. And these are the important experiment design which we discussed last day, the informal experimentation design and the formal experimental design. So in informal, before and after without control, after only with control, before and after with control. So slowly we progressed from very crude to more sophisticated experimentation. And then we went into completely randomized design. We explained what it is, and then random replication design, randomized block design. We explained Latin square design we started and showed how it can do. So, and there the final is the factorial design. So factorial designs are used in experiments where the effects of varying more than one factor are to be determined. They are specifically important in several economic and social phenomena. So as you can understand, the factorial designs, the most advanced design, but it's more important in several economic and social phenomena where usually a large number of factors affect a particular problem. So factorial design can be of two types, simple factorial design and complex factorial design. So we start with simple factorial design. In case of simple factorial design, we consider the effects of varying two factors on the dependent variable. So only two factors are considered. But when an experiment is done with more than two factors, we use complex factorial designs. Okay. So if the dependent variable of your experiment is dependent on two factors, the best experimentation we can use is the simple factorial design. And in case where it exceeds two factors, means the dependence of the dependent variable exceeds two factors, then the experiment has to be done using complex factorial design. So this is a broad which is sufficient to know because we may not go into the very details of this. Simple factorial design is also termed as a two factorial design. Since it involves two, so it's two factorial design, whereas complex factorial design is known as multifactorial design because there are more than two factors involved which affects the dependent variable of your study. Simple factorial design either may be 2 into 2 simple factorial design, or it may be 3 into 4 or 5 into 3 or like type of simple factorial design. This is an example. In this design, the extraneous variable to be controlled by homogeneity is called the control variable. And the independent variable which is manipulated is called the experimental variable. This is the experimental variable. Then there are two treatments of the experimental variable and two levels of control variable. As such, there are four cells. There are four cells because two treatments of experimental variable and two levels of control variable. So there are four cells into which the sample is divided. Each of the four combinations would provide one treatment or experimental condition. Subjects are assigned at random to each treatment in same manner as in randomized design, group design. The means for different cells may be obtained along with the means for different rows and columns. Means of different cells represent the mean scores for the dependent variable, and the column means in the given design are termed the main effect for treatments without taking into account any differential effect that is due to the level of control variable. Similarly, the row means is in the said design are termed the main effects for level without regard to treatment. And this is the example of simple factorial design 2 into 2, 4 cells. And this is an example of more complex. We just touch upon this that experiments more than two factors at a time involve the use of complex factorial design. A design which considers three or more independent variables simultaneously is called complex factorial design. So this is an example of this given in this column. So why are factorial design used? So we have discussed informal design 3 types, formal design 4 types, and we have finally come into the 4th formal design, which is a factorial design. But why do we use this? They provide equivalent accuracy, as happens in the case of experiments with only one factor, with less labor and as such are source of economy. Okay, so it's a more economic designs and more accurate design. Using factorial design, we can determine the main effects of two or more factors in one single experiment. So in one experiment, you can determine so many factors which affect your dependent variable. They permit various other comparisons of interest. For example, they give information about such effects which cannot be obtained by treating one single factor at a time. The determination of interaction effect is possible in case of factorial design. Okay, so we complete the experimental design and move on to methods of data collection. So today we will start methods of data collection and continue till next class. And this is our 10th class probably, and we have 4 lectures left in this part. So let us start with methods of data collection, which is the next stage of your research methodology. Okay, the task of data collection begins after a research problem has been defined and research design plan chalked out. So you are doing the research design, right? So different research stages you have already know, and you are doing the research design. So you have defined your problem, done a literature survey and research hypothesis completed, and then slowly what you do, you have to design your data collection. Means you have to not design, you have to do the, means now you have to do real experiments, means you have to do the task of data collection, right? So while deciding about the method of data collection to be used for the study, the researcher should keep in mind 2 types of data, which is primary and secondary. So they are talking about 2 types of data, primary and secondary. So you have to understand what do you mean by these. Primary data are those which are collected afresh and for the first time, and thus happen to be original in character. So your research can consist of primary data collection. So what is that primary data? The primary data are those which are collected for the first time. Okay, means something novel, and thus happen to be original in character. And what do you mean by secondary data? Secondary data, on the other hand, are those which have already been collected by someone else and which have already been passed through the statistical process. So this is the difference between primary and secondary data. Okay, primary data are for the first time which you are doing and are original in character, while secondary data which has already been collected earlier by somebody else and it has passed through the statistical process. The methods of collecting primary and secondary data differ. So collecting, how you collect primary data or secondary differ? Definitely they are differing. Why? Since primary data are to be originally collected, while in the case of secondary data, the nature of data collection work is merely that of compilation. So primary data collection means you have to do the original experiments because it is original in character or novel or doing for the first time, and you have to collect the data using experiments. While secondary data, what you do? Secondary data is already published in literature because it has already been done by somebody else and you have to analyze it. So what you do? It's basically compilation of what is available in the open literature, okay, or somewhere else. Collection of primary data. So what are the methods of collection of primary data? First and foremost is doing experiments. Okay, so the scientists can collect primary data using what? Performing experiments. So this is the method of collecting primary data. While research which consists of surveys, their collection of primary data is done used by performing surveys. Okay, there are several methods of collecting primary data. So it is mentioned that there are several methods of collecting primary data, particularly in surveys and descriptive researches. Important ones are listed. What is there? What are the different methods by which you can do a survey? This number 1 is observation method. Okay, so you observe something and then collect or jot down your observation. So this is observation method of data collection. Interview method. So in a survey, so one we explained that doing experiments, and other one of data collection we told surveys. So surveys, there are several methods. One is observation methods and one is interview method. So you want to do a survey, say basically for surveys. So it can be a consumer research, so how the consumer feels going in a very busy marketplace. So what you have to do, you have to interview the consumers, right? Isn't it? So it's called the interview method, which we'll study in more details later on. Through questionnaires, through a set of questions, and then you ask the question to different people, and then you get the data collection. Through schedules, other methods which include warranty cards, distributor audits, pantry audits, consumer panels using mechanical devices, and so on. So these are the methods of data collection, or in fact, primary data collection. The primary data collection you can do by performing experiments or performing surveys. So surveys can be done by several methods, by observation method, by interview method, by questionnaires, through schedules, or other methods. So now we come into the collection of data through questionnaires. Okay, this method of data collection is quite popular. So this is a popular method of data collection, particularly in case of big inquiries. So a research which consists of very big inquiries. So collection of data through questionnaires is a very popular or one of the most convincing way of primary data collection. It is being adopted by private individuals, research workers, private and public organizations, and even by governments. So governments collect a lot of data through questionnaires because a proper data collection, primary data collection is required from the groundwork, okay? And then only it can be researched or analyzed and then changes implemented to whatever variables we are concerned with, okay? So there are certain merits of this type of data collection. What are those? The merits claimed on behalf of this method are: there is low cost even when the universe is large and is widely spread geographically. Okay, the first merit is low cost or economy. It is free from bias of the interviewer. Answers are in respondent's own words. So if you have questionnaire, it is better than, they say, data collection to question is better than that interview method. Why it is mentioned like that? Because it is free from the bias of the interviewer, because the interviewer may have selected the question according to his bias, but here it is free from bias. So first is economics, second is bias free. Respondents have adequate time to give well thought out answers. So through questionnaires, the respondents respond to their own words and their own thought process, right? And they have enough time to give well thought answers, which are, again, if you collect a lot of respondents, then you can get a very good comparison of data or very big collection of data of primary data. Respondents who are not easily approachable can also be reached conveniently. So through questionnaires, what you can do, the universe means the sampling can be very large, okay? Because you do not have to go and the interview method to the person to person. Instead, you can send through various online resources like social media or anything, and then you can get the convenience of reaching to large number of respondents. So your data becomes more free from bias, more accurate, and more adequate, isn't it? Large samples can be made use of, and thus the results can be made more dependable and reliable. So what is the benefit of large sample? Is that your research or your data, primary data that you've collected through questionnaire, is more dependent, bias-free, and reliable, isn't it? Because the number of respondents or sample that you can collect is huge, isn't it? So the population is widespread or diverse, and the individual bias can be removed based on the large number of sampling. But there are certain demerits. So these are the merits that you can go through economic process. You don't have to go for an interview personally. Universe is large, spread geographically. It is free from bias of the interviewer. Answers are in respondents' own words. Respondents have adequate time to give well thought out answers. Respondents who are not usually approachable can also be reached conveniently. Large samples can be made use of, and thus the results can be made more dependable and reliable. But there are demerits. What are those? The main demerits of this system are low rate of return of the duly filled in questionnaires, bias due to no response. So you cannot, so once you go to interview, the respondent generally respond, isn't it? But here, the problem is you may keep on sending emails, but the respondent may not respond. You keep on WhatsApping them, but you may not get a response. You share Google Sheets, but you fail to get response from a large population. So, okay, what was considered a merit now becomes a demerit because the duly filled in questionnaire is not coming back to you. It can be used only when respondents are educated and cooperative. So cooperation of the respondent is very much required, isn't it? The control over questionnaire may be lost once it is sent. Once it goes out of hand, you cannot modify the questionnaires. There is an inbuilt flexibility because of the difficulty of amending the approach. There is also possibility of ambiguous replies or omission of replies. Okay, ambiguous replies you cannot eliminate, and some certain questionnaires they may not reply. So there you will face difficulty. It is difficult to know whether willing respondents are truly represented. Okay, those who have sent a response have they given a correct or they are experienced enough to give the response. Okay, so whether they are a true representative of a questionnaire, you are not aware of that. This method is likely to be slowest of all. So as you can understand, so these are the demerits of your method of data collection through questionnaires. So as with every method, it has its own advantages and own disadvantages. Okay, so we have gone through the merits as well as the demerits of this method of data collection through questionnaires. Before using this method, questionnaires, it is always advisable to conduct pilot survey. Okay, so it is mentioned that before using this method, means the method of questionnaires, it is always advisable to conduct a pilot survey for testing the questionnaires. In a big inquiry, the significance of pilot survey is felt very much. Pilot survey is in fact the replica and rehearsal of the main survey. Such a survey being conducted by experts bring to the light the weaknesses, if any, of the questionnaires and also of the survey techniques. From the experience gained in this way, improvement can be affected. So it is suggested that before implementing this method, we do a pilot survey for testing the questionnaire. In a big inquiry, the significance of pilot survey is very much felt. Pilot survey is in fact replica and rehearsal of the main survey. Okay. So before the actual questionnaire survey, you do a pilot survey, which is a prelude of your main survey. What are the advantages that it brings to light? The weaknesses of the questionnaire and also of the survey technique. If you go to experts, they can tell you about the weaknesses or the ambiguities in the question itself. Okay, so the pilot survey is better so that the actual survey, in the actual survey, you send more relevant questionnaires and to a more relevant population or sampling. So what is the advantage of pilot survey is that from the experience gained in this way, improvement can be affected. Okay. Collection of data through schedules. So this method of data collection is very much like the collection of data through questionnaires, with little difference. What is the difference? We have marked in red that the little difference which lies in the fact that the schedules, pro forma containing a set of questions, are being filled in by the enumerators who are specially appointed for the purpose. So it reaches more relevant population. These enumerators, along with schedules, go to respondents, put to them the questions from the pro forma in the order of the questions are listed, and record the replies in the space meant for the same in the pro forma. In certain situations, schedules may be handed over to respondents and enumerators may help them in recording their answers to various questions in the schedules. Enumerators explain the aims and objectives of the investigation and also remove the difficulties which any respondent may feel in understanding the implications of a particular question or the definition of concept of difficult terms. So, in questionnaires, the researcher directly sent the questions to the respondent. Here, it is been filled by the enumerators, okay, who are specially appointed for this purpose. So they act as a, means what I will say means a helping hand in between the researcher and the respondent, so that you get proper replies, because the enumerators help in what way? In certain situations, schedules may be handed over to respondents and enumerators may help them in recording their answers to various questions in the said schedules. Enumerators explain the aims and objectives of the investigation. So that is the advantage. And also remove difficulties which any respondent may feel in understanding the implication of a particular question. This method requires the selection of enumerators for filling up schedules or assisting respondent. This method of data collection is very useful in extensive inquiries and can lead to fairly reliable results. It is, however, very expensive and is usually adopted in investigations conducted by governmental agencies or some big organization. Example, population census all over the world is conducted through this method. Okay, so this is how population census is done, and so India is also planning the census, and these are done through enumerators. Now, these are the methods of primary data collection. So we discussed primary data, okay, and primary data is done through experiments or through surveys, and surveys can be done through observation, interview, questionnaires, schedules. So we discuss what are the advantages through questionnaires and the disadvantages, and through schedules what are the advantages and what does it means. Now you go on to the secondary data collection of secondary data. Secondary data means the data that are already available. That is, they refer to data which have already been collected and analyzed by somebody else. So we understood what is secondary data. When the researcher utilizes secondary data, then she has to look into various sources from where the data can be obtained. Like in literature survey, we discuss in detail the sources. Here also, when we consider secondary data collection, we have to take care of the sources which we are using for our data collection. Okay. Secondary data may either be published data or unpublished data. So both published data or unpublished data can be used. Published data are available in various publications of central, state, or local governments, various publications of foreign governments or of international bodies and their subsidiary organizations, technical and trade journals, books, magazines, newspapers, reports and publications of various associations connected with business and industry, banks, stock exchanges, etc. Reports prepared by research scholars, universities, economists, public records, historical documents, other sources of published information. Unpublished data are available in where diaries, letters, unpublished biographies, autobiographies also may be available with scholars and research workers, trade associations, labor bureaus, and other public, private, individual organizations. Researchers must be very careful in using secondary data. So we come into secondary data collection, and in secondary data means what we are collecting by secondary data. What we mean by secondary data is that data which is already available. It's either published or unpublished data, but it is available to you. So you have to collect the data. So what is most important, utmost important, is the source which you are using for the data collection. So various type of source you can use depending upon your requirement of data. So first it can be published or unpublished. So for published data, what are the various sources which you will approach? The various sources are the publications of state, central, and local governments, or even of foreign governments of international bodies, their subsidiary organization, journals. If it's technical, then technical journals. If it's trade related to trade journals, means journals depending upon your area of study. Books, magazines, and newspapers. Reports and publications of various associations connected with business and industry, banks, stock exchanges. reports prepared by research scholar, universities, economists. So these reports are also very important and relevant in terms of secondary data collections, because a lot of data, primary data, has been collected by research scholars and university students, economists. So those can be used by a researcher as their secondary data for analysis and research, right? And also the researcher can go into public records, historical documents, and other sources of published information. While the researcher can also go for unpublished data collection, for secondary data collection, which includes personal diaries, letters, unpublished biographies, autobiographies, okay, scholars' work, scholars' diaries, trade associations, data, labor bureaus, and other public, private, individual organizations. So you have to be careful in using this secondary data, in using the source of the secondary data, and using the secondary data. Okay. Selection of appropriate method for data collection. The researcher must judicially select the methods of data collection for his or her own study, keeping in view the following factors. So what are the factors you should keep in mind while selecting the appropriate method of data collection? So while selecting the appropriate method for data collection, the researcher must keep in mind 4 factors. What are they? First is nature and scope and object of inquiry. Okay. Second is availability of funds. Third is the time factor. And fourth is the precision required. So somebody doing research or analysis of consumer research of a particular, say suppose product, they have to understand the nature and scope of their inquiry or the object of their inquiry. So they can analyze or collect data specific to their object and scope of research. Okay. If somebody is doing research, they have to collect primary or secondary data. They have to think about what availability of funds is a very important factor that creep into their data collection. So if it is primary data collection, experimental research, what are the experiments they can use? The funding is very important. Time factor. So as we discussed during our research design stage, that time for experimental data collection or in surveys or secondary data collection, you have to be precise about the time that will be utilized for the data collection. It cannot be going into beyond your research limits, right? You have to have a fixed or a finite time, and you on that basis to collect the data. You cannot. So what are the open literature is easily available. You have to search and go through this. You cannot go and digging into other literature which is not available easily. And also the precision, how much precision you require for the data collection. Guidelines for constructing, developing questionnaires and schedule. So what are the guidelines for constructing, developing questionnaires or schedule? So these are the several guidelines which the researcher has to keep into mind. So researcher must keep in view the problem he is to study. The researcher must keep in view the problem he is to study, for it provides the starting point for developing the questionnaire or schedule. She must be clear about the various aspects of her research problem to be dealt with in the course of her or his research project. So the first guideline is for developing your questionnaire or schedule is that you have to stick to your research problem. You cannot deviate from your research problem, right? Appropriate form of questions depends on the nature of information sought, the sample respondents, and the kind of analysis intended. The researcher must decide whether to use closed or open-ended questions. Questions should be simple and must be constructed with a view to their forming a logical part of a well-thought-out tabulation plan. The units of enumeration should also be defined precisely so that they can ensure accurate and full information. So this is the second part that researcher has to keep in mind while developing the questionnaire or schedule, is that the form of question should be appropriate. Rough draft of question schedule will be prepared, giving due thought to the appropriate sequence of putting question. Question or schedules previously drafted may also be looked into at this stage. Researcher must invariably re-examine and in case of need, may revise the rough draft for a better one. Technical defects must be minutely scrutinized and removed. pilot study should be undertaken, as we did for questionnaires, as we already discussed, that pilot study should be undertaken for pre-testing the questionnaire. The questionnaire may be edited in the light of the results of the pilot study. So pilot study forms an important part. Questionnaire must contain simple but straightforward directions for the respondents so that they may not feel any difficulty in answering the question. Okay. So these are the guidelines for developing proper questionnaires or schedule. So the first part is it has to be sticking to the relevance of the problem. So you cannot deviate from your problem. The questionnaire has to be on the topic of your research. The questions should be appropriate, and the information short should also be proper. First, a rough draft of the questionnaire should be made, not that directly you send it. So the rough draft of the questionnaire should be made and then re-examine, and in case of need, revise the rough draft for a better one. Okay. So what you do, you first prepare a rough draft, discuss with experts. Okay. And once you identify the discrepancies or the ambiguities in your rough draft, you try to solve this so that your questionnaires or schedules are technically more appropriate and correct and free of ambiguities. Then what you do a pilot study. Means before sending out the questionnaire to the respondents, you do a pilot study. You send out the questionnaires or schedules to experts so that you get a proper feedback from them and modify the questionnaires for a better responding. Questionnaire must contain simple but straightforward directions for the respondent so that they may not feel any difficulty in answering the question. So you must be well aware that you should not put the respondent into some sort of difficulty in responding to your question. Okay. So guidelines for successful interviewing. So what are the guidelines for a successful interviewing? So interviewing is one method of surveying or secondary data collection. So interviewing is an art and one learned by experience. So initially, what is the interviewer? Initially, they might fumble, or the question may not be appropriate, or the sequencing they may be suffering. But as and when he goes on taking means interviews, he will become more and more rigorous and more appropriate to the point. And we have seen this. Interviewer must plan in advance and should fully know the problem under consideration. So this is very important that before interviewing, going for an interview, you should plan for the interview and also have a good knowledge base of the problem you are considering. He, she must choose a suitable time and place so that the interview may be at ease during the interview period. For this purpose, some knowledge of the daily routine of the interview is essential. So once you go to the interview, the knowledge about the daily routine of the interview is essential, because if you go during his busy hours, he or she may not answer you properly. Okay, the interview may fail because a proper answer you will not get it. Instead, if you have an idea about the daily routine of the interview, you can go to his free hours where he can relax and give you more appropriate answers. Interviewer's approach must be friendly and informal. So the approach must be friendly and informal. Initially, friendly greetings in accordance with the cultural pattern of the interview should be exchanged, and then the purpose of the interview should be explained. So it's self-explanatory that the interview will be informal and friendly, and the exchange of greetings should be according to the local environment and local cause. All possible efforts should be made to establish proper rapport with the interviewee. People are motivated to communicate when the atmosphere is favorable. So once you establish friendliness with your interviewee, then more appropriate answers you can get, because the communication becomes at ease. Okay, so flow comes between the interviewer and the interviewee. Interviewer must know that the ability to listen with understanding, respect and curiosity is the gateway to communication. So as you know, what is the good communication? That your patience to listen. Okay, so you are having enough patience, you are listening to us throughout this class, and hence must act according during the interview. So during the interview, if the interviewer have a good patience to listen properly, then the interview succeeds, because the communication is then going to flow between the interviewer and the interviewee, because the interviewee have the understanding that, okay, the person who has come for me to get the interview is interested in my answers, right? For all this, the interviewer must be intelligent and must be a man with self-restraint and self-discipline. So here, the question of self-discipline and self-restraint character of the interviewer is very much important. To the extent possible, there should be a free-flowing interview, and the questions must be well phrased in order to have full cooperation of the interview. But the interviewer must control the course of the interview for the objective of the study. In case of big inquiries, when the task of collecting information is to be accomplished by several interviewers, there should be an interview guide to be observed by all, so as to ensure reasonable uniformity in respect of all salient points in the study. So we discussed the guidelines for a successful interviews. So a lot depends upon the interviewer. So what are those? Because he has to be more precise. He has to be friendly and informal with the interviewer. Should establish a rapport, a proper rapport with the interview. Should be respecting the interview, because then only the interviewee will be free to answer his or her questions. Otherwise, if he feels that he is not respected, then he may not give a proper interview to the interviewer. So a man, an interviewer with a good self-respect and self-discipline, who can perform as a very good communicator, means patience of listening, serves as a good interviewer. To the extent possible, free-flowing interview should be made. Okay, and the question should be well phrased. Okay, and in case of big inquiries, see, where do you need several interviewers, there should be an interview guide to be observed by all. Okay, so these are the salient points. The difference between survey and experiment. So what are the differences? The survey are conducted in case of descriptive research studies, where an experiment are part of experimental research studies. Survey types research. So we did what for secondary data collection. The primary data, we can do a experiment or you can perform a survey. So what are the difference between experiment and survey? There's a large, you can understand there is a lot of differences. So we are discussing this. What are the differences between survey and an experiment? Surveys are conducted in case of descriptive research study. Okay. Whereas experiments are part of experimental research studies. Survey type research studies usually have larger sample because the percentage of responses generally happens to be low. Surveys are concerned with describing, recording, analyzing, and interpreting conditions that either exist or existed. The researcher does not manipulate the variable or arrange for events to happen. Experimental research provides a systematic and logical method for answering the question. What will happen if this is done with certain variables are carefully controlled or manipulated? In fact, deliberate manipulation part of experimental method. Surveys are usually appropriate in case of social behavioral science, whereas experiments are mostly essential feature of physical and natural sciences. This is very important. Surveys are usually appropriate in case of social and behavioral sciences, whereas experiments are mostly an essential feature of physical and natural sciences. Surveys are an example of field research, whereas an experiments generally constitute an example of laboratory research. Surveys may either be census or sample surveys, but in case of experiments, data are collected from several units of measurement. So as you can understand, that surveys are generally field research, experiments, laboratory research. Surveys may be census or sample surveys, experiments are collection of measurements or readings. Surveys are usually appropriate in case of social and behavioral sciences, while experiments are done usually in case of physical and natural sciences. Okay, in surveys, you are describing or recording and analyzing and interpreting the data, while experimental, you are manipulating the experimental conditions, right, and collecting the data. Survey in research study usually have larger sampling is survey large because the surface percent of responses generally happens to be low. So these are the different, the major differences between a survey type of primary data collection and experiment type of primary data collection. Surveys are generally conducted in case of descriptive research, while experiment in experiment type of research. The sampling size varies. Samplings are much more in case of surveys, much less in case of experiment. Surveys are concerned with describing, recording, analyzing, and interpreting conditions. An experiment will manipulate one of the variables. Surveys are usually appropriate for social and behavioral sciences. Experiments for physical and natural sciences. Surveys are generally field research, while experiments are generally laboratory research. Surveys may be either census or sample surveys, while experiments can be collected from several readings of measurements. Okay, so thank you for your patience and understanding. And we meet again on Monday at 4 o'clock for the next class. Okay, thank you. And we'll do some division in the last two classes of this part. Thank you.